Welcome to the second of what I hope is mini basics on a Yu-Gi-Oh deck, what MBT referred to as a primer. I don't really have any sort of frame of reference as to what's supposed to be in these, so I'm just kind of giving information that I think is important for somebody who might be interested in picking up a deck. This deck is extremely powerful, but was pushed out of the meta quite a while ago. It's currently seeing a lot of play in Master Duel, but this video is made specifically for the TCG with cards and interactions that are prevalent in the TCG kept in mind. Now, unlike the first video, what you're looking at right now are the Sword Soul cards that do not see play. These are all Sword Soul specific cards that see absolutely zero play in the Sword Soul deck. These could theoretically see play in certain scenarios, but 99% of the time, you are not going to see any of these cards. So just know that they exist, but you don't have to be concerned about them. So let's go ahead and get straight into talking about Sword Soul. So Sword Soul is an archetype of monsters that have effects that summon tokens that are tuners. Each of these has an effect that allows you to summon a tuner, a level 4 tuner token. These can be used to go into the Sword Soul specific or generic synchros. By far, the strongest of the three is Moye. Moye only requires a Sword Soul card or a worm monster in your hand to be revealed, and it can summon the token. When this card is sent to the graveyard as a synchro summon, it allows you to draw a card. So this represents functionally a +2 over the course of 2 effect activations, because it gives you a card in the token which can be converted into synchro summons, which can then plus you even further. And when it's sent to the graveyard for that synchro summon, it allows you to draw a card. It's extremely powerful. It is by far the strongest normal summon. Taya is probably the worst of the three, but it is the one I'm going to talk about next. Taya has functionally the same effect as Moye in the sense that it summons the level 4 token, but this one requires you to banish a Sword Soul card or a worm monster from your graveyard. You can't necessarily guarantee that you're going to have that set up turn 1, so this card isn't as good to draw on your first turn as Moye is, but this card is fantastic later in the game. You can normal summon it, banish one of your spent Sword Soul monsters like a Moye or even like a spell or trap, and then you can summon the token. And if you're banishing a spell or trap, they usually have banish effects, which means that you can also get advantage off of banishing those cards. This card isn't usually played at maximum copies just because of the fact that it's not as good of a card to draw as Moye, but it is still extremely powerful and extremely useful in the deck. Longwan kind of sits in the middle in terms of the 3 main deck Sword Soul monsters. This one does not need to be normal summoned. Obviously, it's 6 stars, so if you did normal summon it, you'd have to tribute something. But it has a built-in summon effect where you can discard a Sword Soul card or worm. I hope you're noticing a pattern. And then it summons itself from the hand. As part of that same effect, it also summons the token. Unlike these two, well, specifically unlike Moye, whose summon is an on-summon effect to summon the token, this one summons the token as part of its summon effect. So it's immune to things like imperm, effect failure, and the like, because of the fact that the effect to summon activates and technically resolves in hand. So you don't have to worry about any of that. It's also a level 6, which opens up the doors for level 10 synchros, allowing you to summon arguably the most powerful Sword Soul card, Baron. I won't get into the weeds on what Baron does or why it's powerful in the deck. Just know that it is a negate, and negation is extremely powerful in Yu-Gi-Oh! I forgot to mention, I mentioned Moye's graveyard effect. This one allows you to send a Sword Soul card or Worm monster from your deck to the graveyard if it's used as synchro material. This one burns your opponent. So, as you can see, this one's used as synchro material effect is probably the worst of the three. This one's by far the best, as it just gives you a free draw. This one can help set up for future plays because some cards do want to be in the graveyard. And if you know where this is going, knowing the archetype that this deck is mixed with, being able to send cards, worm cards specifically, to the graveyard is extremely powerful, especially in a deck where all of the main deck monsters summon a token which counts as a normal monster. That will make a lot of sense once I get to the non-Sword Soul parts of the deck. So, the spells and traps, really the only ones that you play are Emergence and Blackout. We'll talk about Emergence first. Emergence is what's referred to as a Rota. Rota stands for Reinforcements of the Army. It is the generic spell card that allows you to search a level 4 or lower warrior. It's not important for this deck, but the term is used generally to refer to any card that searches either archetypal or type/attribute specific cards. Rota searches a type. Emergence searches an archetype. However, if you control a synchro monster when you activate this, it can generically search a worm, which means you can get into some of your other cards that, again, we will get to later. This also has an effect that if it's banished, you can target a Sword Soul or worm you control and either decrease or increase its level by 1. That's not very useful. You're not going to be using that very often. There are some fringe cases where this may be helpful, especially considering the fact that you are playing an extremely powerful synchro in the extra deck that isn't an 8 or a 10. So it may be helpful to bear in mind that you not only have access to 8s and 10s, you also have access to other levels because of the fact that Emergence allows you to modulate levels. And the last of the spell traps that's, I think, worth mentioning is Blackout. For anybody who played the game for a long time or was around, this is basically a worm version of Icarus Attack. For those of you that don't know what Icarus Attack is, I'll just explain what Blackout does. Blackout targets a worm you control and 2 cards your opponent controls and destroys them. And it has an effect where if it's banished, you can summon the token that the worm monsters summon. So it summons a level 4 tuner token. Also, I didn't mention this before, but as long as the token's on the field, you can't summon except synchro monsters. So it does lock you out of link summoning as long as the token's on field, but once the token's gone, you can link summon, or before you summon the token, you can link summon. And that will become important when we get to the non-Sword Soul parts of this deck. But before we get to those, I think it's important to also talk about Incredible Ecclesia, the Virtuous. This card is a lore card. If you're not aware, Yu-Gi-Oh! Has a weird quirk where tons of decks are built around the artwork featuring events and characters from a larger, expansive story, referred to as card art lore. This one is specifically in reference to what is referred to as the Albaz lore. If you're more interested in hearing about that, there's tons of videos on YouTube talking about it. I would highly recommend going and checking out Golden Nova. He's got a video series where he talks about the Albaz lore. I believe he's even working on a larger video talking about all of it up until Photon Hypernova, I believe, which is the main set that's most recently come out. This card, says that you can tribute it and summon a Sword Soul monster or a Fallen of Albaz from your hand or deck. Now, the Fallen of Albaz is where the Albaz part of the Albaz lore I mentioned comes from. This also has an effect where if your opponent controls more monsters than you can just special summon this. Typically, though, on your first turn, you're just going to normal summon this, and then you're going to tribute it off to summon the Moye. That's typically the combo: summon it, tribute, special Moye, Moye effect, reveal something in your hand like a long wand or an emergence or something like that, and then summon the token and, get the ball rolling. This card's extremely powerful. The fact that it is also a tuner by itself can sometimes come up. If your token gets removed and you need access to a tuner, this can represent tuner access, because a lot of the synchros that you summon are generic, don't require specific materials except for like a few key exceptions to that. But this card is extremely powerful. It is not a Sword Soul card in name, but it is a Sword Soul card functionally. And before we get into the non-Sword Soul aspects of the deck, I think it's important to talk about the extra deck Sword Soul monsters. First, let's talk about the level 8, Qishao. Qishao is extremely powerful. It has a negation effect where you can banish a Sword Soul card or a worm monster and then negate the effects of a monster on field. That's neat, but really the important thing to note is that this thing searches a Sword Soul card when it's special summoned. But it not just adds to your hand, it can also banish it, which means you can trigger things to do things. Do things like banish the blackout to summon a token, banish the emergence to modulate some levels, so on and so forth. This thing's extremely powerful. Typically, though, what you're doing is you're using Moye to summon it, and then you go activate Moye and Qishao in sequence. Usually sequencing it so that you search before you draw because you want to deck thin, but that's sort of an advanced thing. I won't get too deep into the weeds in a primer video, but basically what this is this represents easy access to blackout, which means you typically only run one, maybe two blackout if you're down bad and really like popping things. But this card is probably the first card that you're going to summon, unless you're doing a play that plays around specifically Nibiru, in which case you would want to summon Baron in order to get a negate. But this card is pretty much always on your end board because it is the strongest level 8 that you can go into. The next one that I want to talk about is Changying. Changying is extremely powerful because it gains attack based on the number of banished cards that you have. And if it's destroyed by card effects, you can banish a card from your graveyard instead. So it has built-in protection. And again, that banish from grave effect can trigger some of your spells and traps. So there's synergy there. And this also has an effect where if a card is banished, you can banish a card from both your opponent's field and grave. And what's incredible is that the protection effect can trigger its own effect to banish cards your opponent has. So this card's extremely strong. And the fact is that Taya can trigger this, Qishao can trigger this, and other things within the deck can trigger this that are not specifically Sword Soul cards. This card's extremely strong. It is probably the level 10 that you're going to go into most often that isn't exactly named Baron. And yeah, it's an extremely powerful option in the extra deck. Speaking of powerful options in the extra deck, you also play Evil Long Wand, as it's colloquially referred to. This is Sword Soul Sinister Sovereign Qixing Long Wand. This has an effect that if you summon another synchro monster, you can draw a card. Or if you synchro summon another worm monster, you can draw a card. And it says if your opponent specials a monster, you can banish one of those monsters, and if you do, inflict damage to your opponent. And It also has an effect where if your opponent activates a spell or trap, you can banish it and then inflict damage to your opponent. So this card isn't as strong as Chang Ying. Chang Ying's banish effect is an extremely powerful interruption. I would say the effects to banish stuff are cool. If you can get both it and Chang Ying on the field, you can very easily get access to, you know, instant speed banishes by waiting for your opponent to activate a spell or trap and then banishing it and then activating Chang Ying on a new chain. But this one you're not going to go into as often, but it is still extremely powerful and still worth playing in the extra deck. And I think we've come to the point where it's important to start talking about some of the non Sword Soul cards. And really, the only part of the deck that really matters that is worth talking about is the other engine that you mix Sword Soul with, an extremely sizable engine. One that I personally was a huge fan of when it first came out, but never really saw any sort of real competitive success until Sword Soul, and that's the 10 Ys. The 10 Ys are a set of monsters that summon themselves from the hand if you control no monsters or if all monsters you control are non-effect monsters. And they have effects where they can banish themselves from the graveyard if you control a non-effect monster to do something. These three are by far the strongest 10 Ys in terms of the main deck monsters. Vishuddha saw extensive play even before Sword Soul came out. This one has the effect where when you banish it from the grave, you can return a card on the field to the hand. It specifically has to be on your opponent's side of the field. This one allows you to add back a banished worm monster, and this one lets you summon a 10 Yi from deck. So, as you can see, these are all extremely powerful. And the fact that Adhara is a level 1 tuner means that it opens up a lot of plays in terms of the levels that you can go into. And because the other two are 7s, Adhara plus either of these two makes your Chi-Shao. So you can even get access to it without necessarily having to specifically open Moye or Taya or any of those things. You don't get the draw off of Moye if you do it that way, but it's still worth going into. And then Heavenly Dragon Circle is technically a 10 Yi card because it lists 10 Yi in its text, but this just allows you to take a worm on field and cycle it for a worm from deck. You basically tribute a worm and then either summon it or add it to your hand. The only way you can summon it, though, is if you tribute a non-effect. And there is a way that you can achieve that, but I will get to that in a second. You can also banish this from the grave to add a 10 Yi. You can activate both of those effects in the same turn, and that does trigger the Chang Ying, by the way. So yet more synergies with these different things. Now, the thing about these 10 Ys is that on field, if you just summon one, you can't summon another one because you now don't only control non-effect monsters. But thankfully, 10 Yi comes with a non-effect link 1. So you summon the 10 Yi, link it off into Monk of the 10 Yi, and then you have access to summon another 10 Yi. The common way to do it is to try and get into a scenario where you can summon the Ashuna, link it into a 10 Yi, summon the Adhara, and then use the Ashuna engrave to banish itself to summon a Vishuddha. You have a 1 and a 7. You can go into a level 8 synchro, which could be Chi-Shao, or it can be a different level 8 synchro. There are other ones that we play, but I'm not going to go into those because I feel like depending on the format, you're not really guaranteed to be playing those. You're also not guaranteed to be playing the 10 Ys, but it's been proven through, years of, people playing the deck and trying out different builds that the 10 Yi variant is by far the strongest. And I think moving forward, Sword Soul and 10 Yi are just going to become, known as two decks that just play each other, right? So I think it's worth talking about both of them in this video. Now, there are other Tenyi extra deck monsters. You do play a Synchro. I'm not going to go into it. It's a tech option. You could theoretically not play it if you wanted to. It's not necessary. Another card that's not really necessary, but I am going to talk about it, is Shaman of the Tenyi. Shaman of the Tenyi is pretty strong, again, because of the fact that the tokens lock you into synchros. You can't go into this if you control sword soul and then the token. But if you do a play where you summon the monk and then you summon another and you have something in the grave that you want to reborn, you can link those two into this and reborn it. Or if you have an on-field sword soul that had its effect negated, you can link it and monk into this, discard a card, and then bring something back. You know, it just gives you more options. It also makes the Taya effect to send a worm to the grave far more powerful, because that worm that gets sent to the grave can then be reborn off of the shaman. It's an extremely powerful extra deck option. I think that there's very little argument to be made on whether you should be playing this or not. It's extremely powerful. I mean, technically, I guess it is a flex spot to a certain extent, but I would say that you're probably going to play it. The difficulty with Sword Soul, in a similar vein to Eldritch and other more linear decks, is that there really isn't a combo necessarily to show off. So, for the most part, that's kind of all you really need to know about Sword Soul and Tenyi. If you're interested in playing the deck, I would recommend, starting with these cards, maxing out on a lot of them, maxing out on basically all of the main deck stuff except for Taya and the Blackout. And then just kind of fill in the gaps. I mostly play hand traps in the gaps. So, a few, going second staples like Forbidden Droplet, just to kind of equalize in games where I'm forced to go second. And, there are things that you can play. You could theoretically play Mare in this as well, as sort of a shaman target to reborn, or something to search or summon off of the Yazi that you play in the extra deck that I didn't mention, which is the level 7 that you get access to if you level modulate, or if you use Adhara as your tuner in conjunction with Longwan. But for the most part, yeah, this deck's crazy. It's not as good as it used to be because of the fact that the meta's kind of moved past it at this point. But I think it's still an extremely powerful deck. It's seeing huge amounts of success in Master Duel, which is nice to see. And the nice thing is that you kind of have the liberty to just play whatever synchros you prefer at certain levels. Like if you have certain level 8 synchros that you really like, that you want to play in this deck, there's nothing stopping you from playing them. Like, I personally play Scarlight Red Dragon Archfiend as a means of sort of, playing into time, but also having an extremely easily accessible board breaker. You could also play things like Savage Dragon, although your access to Link monsters is a little iffy. But through the Tenyi line, if you have access to the Tenyis, you can very easily put a Link 1 in the grave, which gives you access to another Omni Negate that isn't exactly barren. There's also lines that you can do. Where I mentioned a level 8 that I haven't talked about yet, where you go into Baxia and then Chaofeng. The Chaofeng is used to lock your opponent out of activating light effects, which specifically stops them from Nibiruing you. And again, I didn't mention this initially because Nibiru being a problem in the format is extremely format dependent. Nibiru isn't always a great card. There are formats where Nibiru isn't very good, and you don't necessarily have to worry about it as much. But it is helpful to know these things. to know what your options are. But yeah, that's Sword Soul. I hope that this was helpful. I hope that you learned something. I hope that this inspires you to maybe check out the deck, or maybe you can refer back to this if you're ever in a situation where you're playing somebody that's playing Sword Soul. Maybe this will give you the ability to, have a leg up on that person. Either way, thanks for watching. See you in the next one. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Any feedback on this would be greatly appreciated. If there's something that I didn't cover in this video that you think I should have covered, feel free to let me know, and I'll see you guys in the next one.